My name's Daniel Lopez. My number is 222-6341. I was convicted of murder. Being with this case is gruesome, and it's not the norm. I think we could all be dangerous people. You know what I mean? Every human being on this earth can be dangerous if they're pushed to that point in their life. I know people want to know, was I in the right state of mind? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? Was I sober? Was I on drugs? I know people want to know all this, but this case is not what I want to be remembered as. This case is just another chapter in my life.
When you have a case like this, it's just terrible. The facts are terrible. It's everything you wouldn't want to see on a case. It's gory, it's gruesome. The evidence, was stacked against Daniel. But I get called in often for people that other lawyers don't want. And that's what happened in Daniel's case. My name's Charles Bunk. I'm a criminal defense attorney here in San Antonio, Texas. Daniel, he's scary. He's visibly imposing. And he does present himself, or he wants to present himself as this mean, evil person. But I absolutely think Candy Dominguez was in charge of this whole thing. The whole thing started with Candy being manipulative. They're both, in my opinion, equally culpable. How would I describe their relationship? Demented. This is a letter from Candy to Daniel Lopez. If you look at the envelope, Mrs. Candy Lopez to Mr. Daniel Lopez, and then, it's full of love. I love you, I love you, I love you. I loved you from the minute I saw you. You read these and you think they've got this really strong, loving relationship, but I know what they did and I know what they're capable of doing. And then on the back, she uses her go-to phrase, ride or die, and then fuck Bonnie and Clyde, wife and husband. It's almost as if she's saying, Bonnie and Clyde got nothing on us. You read these things and you would think that his loving wife was going to come say he didn't do it. And yet, when she testified, there was no love at all between Candy and Daniel. She came and she said, that guy right there is the guy that did all this stuff. I think he thought this loving wife was going to come, and that's not who showed up. Candy showed up.
I feel like we clicked at first, but then once I got locked up and she got locked up, I started seeing the different side of her. I was like, this is not the Candy I know, but she's just playing her part. She's just playing the system. You didn't see me smiling when I was on trial. She put on this little show, made it seem like she was crazy. She made it seem like a circus. I was raised up in San Antonio, Texas, on the west side of town. The kind of sketchy neighborhood, harsh. and hard upbringing. Even as a child, I kind of walked into school seeing prostitutes and a lot of drug dealing going on. They respected me and showed me unconditional love. But once you're involved and you're part of something, now you're in the inside, dealing with life, death, extortion, drugs, prostitution, money, everything that you could think of that a lot of people see in these movies. You know, I guess you could say I kind of got involved in lifestyle young. But I was just like, you know, I was already used to females just wanting to mess with me because of the lifestyle I was living. I met Candy through my cousin. I went over there one time and I delivered some drugs, and she was there. We started hanging out. You know, I stayed at her house one time, and then, you know, we got involved with each other, but we just knew each other from a short amount of time, and then all this happened. Well, I guess they would say he injured me, but to me, I was just like, to me, it was nothing major.
So whose idea was it to bring Jose to the house?
Jose to the house? Well, see, I really don't want to talk about it. Like, there was a lot of assumptions on the case, and to this day, people are assuming a lot. They're accusing me of killing Jose, right? But everybody who got to understand, my lord, did you see this man kill this? No, I seen him have a physical altercation, but at the end of the day, he was still breathing when I left. Nobody in this world seen me kill this man. Nobody in this world seen me or witnessed me kill this man. How am I being charged with murder?
So you didn't kill him?
See, a lot happened that night. And I won't talk about who didn't kill him, or if he did kill him, or if I did kill him, or if Gabriel killed him, or Candy killed him. Only God knows what happened that night. And then when I was on trial, they started bringing up other stuff, other murders, and I honestly gotta say, it was a lot for me.
In the sentencing phase, they brought up another murder of Dominique Hernandez.
Of course.
Did you kill Dominique?
No.
Have you ever killed anyone?
Of course.
You've never been prosecuted for any of the murders you did do?
No. No, I haven't.
The evidence was overwhelming. So Daniel and I were behind the 8 ball from the get-go. All the witnesses that were at the house all said Daniel was there. And some of the surrounding witnesses, if you will, they said that Daniel said that out loud. I told you I was going to get him, and I got him. So the defense was not so much, hey, I have an alibi, or hey, somebody else did it. Our defense tried to kind of shift some of the blame away from Daniel to just get the light off of him and try to, hey, look over there. There's something really good happening over there. Go look at that. Don't look at him. And I think that there was at least hope that maybe Candy wasn't going to come say anything against her boyfriend. But when she got up there, she wanted him to know, you know what? I got a deal and you didn't. She was almost proud to be sitting up there, you know, able to tell her story and throw him under the bus. And she did it well. I don't have an issue with Candy getting a deal. I think they needed Candy's testimony. But I would have liked to have seen her get more time. Even if she serves her whole time, she will get out after 30 years. But she was every bit as complicit in this thing as Daniel was. She set the whole thing up. I mean, it's only fair if both sides get a fair shot. And as you get to know Daniel, you're not that surprised that Daniel did what he did. But you see Candy and you think, well, okay, can she really be that evil? And apparently she can. By the time she testified, I'd read enough of her letters to realize she's just as dangerous as he is. Sylvia's testimony was terrible, and it was a bad situation. Pee-wee and Daniel had a beef, I get that. Sylvia had no dog in this fight whatsoever. But they keep Sylvia in the bathroom for days, and they kept her basically hostage. Sylvia testified that she's in the bathroom of the house and she could hear the beating as it happened. She described the sound she heard like the pinging of the aluminum bats. That was a hard thing to sit through and listen to.
We are a close family. Sylvia was the oldest of 6 children. She was a very good big sister. And she was a good mommy, too. Now, we don't see that spark in her anymore. It's just sadness, like she's just hollow. She's alive, but she's not living. My name is Andriana, and I'm Sylvia's mother. Jose was a funny guy. He wasn't a perfect person, but he was good to Sylvia. He gave his life that she would be safe. He died telling her that he loved her. There was nothing that she could do. The first time I saw her after this happened, she crawled in the bed with me and got in kind of the fetal position. And she started to tell me what happened. Sylvia and Jose walked through the door. Daniel started hitting Jose with the bat. He just beat the life out of him. He was yelling out for Candy. He was yelling for his cousin. And Sylvia told him, "Why are you yelling for her? She put us in this situation." They ended up tying Sylvia up and put her in the shower in Candy's restroom. And they basically held her hostage for days. She was hogtied. So she had the marking on her ankles and her wrists. She still has scars from it. Later on, Daniel took Sylvia out to the barbecue pit. And Jose's leg was on the barbecue pit. It was burned. Daniel told her, "You know what I did to him, and you're a lot smaller. So I believe Daniel is a very dangerous person. But Candy was worse. Candy said that she didn't regret anything. She was bragging about what she did to her own cousin. Candy was just cold. Sylvia said she asked her one time to loosen up the ropes, and she like cursed at her and told her that she wasn't going anywhere. And it's about 3 days after Jose's body was found that Sylvia finally escaped.
Will you guys have a napkin or tissue?
Yeah, I'll get you some.
Right. Then before you, they're crazy. Like,
Okay, they're also in jail right now. Okay, but if there's well, I know, and if there's other people who need to be put in jail, then I need to hear it from you.
yeah, but there's just they're in jail doesn't mean that me or my family is safe.
Okay, well, why don't you explain to me what you know about his death?
I was buried.
Okay, well, you know, walk me through it.
You beat my dude to death in front of me. The only other person that might say something, which I doubt, because right now she's sacrificing her own life.
Who?
I mean, Candy. She, like, got her own cousin killed. She's just psychotic. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's just really crazy.
Nana, Ito. Before this, Candy was my favorite niece. And there wasn't anything she would ever hide from me. Those were the days that I loved her. That was the Candy that I knew. My name is Yvonne Gilkey, and Jose Menchaca Jr. was my son. It was my only son. And we were very close. Jose, Pee-wee. He was always goofy. Since he was little, he was a goofy kid. You know, and he was always happy-go-lucky, you know. Always put a smile on someone's face. And I could never be upset with him too long because he would always make me laugh, no matter what. Pee-wee and Candy, they were first cousins. They were inseparable. They would always watch out for each other. So yeah, I always thought he was safe with Candy. And that was my biggest mistake ever, trusting her. I had been calling my niece Candy, calling her, because that's, if I couldn't get a hold of him, I'd get a hold of her. So she'd tell him to call me. But she never answered my calls or anything. And that's when we got the phone call. And that was the worst day of my life. Her mother's the one that told me. She said, "Are you sitting down?" I go, "No, why? What's going on?" She goes, "Please sit down." She said, My son, Jose, Pee-wee, had been murdered by her daughter, Candy, and her daughter's boyfriend. I would have never imagined it, that she'd have done something like that. This doesn't make no sense to me. Why did she have to go through that extreme? Why did she do it? I was very shocked. She was sarcastic, happy, what she had done. She was proud of what she had did. She sat in court and just laughed. I just seen evil in her. I seen evil in her that I had not ever seen before. And I'm glad that guy, punk-ass motherfucker got life. Candy should have got life too. She planned it. She planned when she was gonna go pick my son up. She planned what they were gonna do. She was the mastermind behind all this. I felt so bad for these kids because of the actions that she took that day. Her kids are now suffering. I would not ever put my kids to see somebody else get killed. Ever would I do that.
Initially, the impression I had of Candy Dominguez was a mother who was maybe, unwillingly involved, trying to protect her children. But at the end of the day, the children are unspoken victims in this case because they have to live with the trauma of what they know took place. When this brutal murder took place, there were 3 children in the household. They were all kindergarten age, very young. And we found through the investigation that Candy put all the children into that back bedroom. She turned the TV on and she told them not to leave. She did that because she knew what was gonna happen. She knew what the plan was. The shocking thing was that this is her own family, and they're all kind of forced to be unwilling participants in this brutal murder.
All right, can you sit down in that chair for me? Oh, it's a weird room. It's got carpet on the walls and stuff. But it's a good one. Okay, so we can have privacy and talk. Okay? My name is Detective Size. This is where I work. Okay? What is your name?
Brianna.
Brianna? And what is your mom's name?
Candy Dominguez.
All right. What we were wanting to talk to you about is something that might have happened there recently. You know what I'm talking about?
I think so.
Kind of. Do you know Pee-wee?
Yes.
Something happened with Pee-wee at your house?
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
I remember watching this video, and the biggest thing that stuck out was just how calm she explained what she saw and heard that day.
We were watching TV in the front room, me and my brother, and then we were watching Netflix, and they told us to go in my room. They said they were moving stuff. Yeah, but I don't think they were because they were in my mom's room, and there was people screaming, "Help me!" And then the other day, Then the next day, well, we went in my mom's room and we saw blood kind of on the couch, and there was 2 holes in the wall. My mom's boyfriend came in, but when he came in, he had a white shirt, white pants on, and he looked like they had blood on him.
Brianna knows what took place.
I mean, she's very descriptive about it. But at the same time, she doesn't seem very emotional about it. She just kind of openly talks about it as if she's describing going to school one day.
So you said that night when you heard screaming, somebody screaming for help. Was it a man or a woman that was screaming
It
for
was a man.
help? A man?
And
Did you recognize the voice?
No. Kind of sounded like Pee-wee, but I'm not sure.
She knew who these people were. She could recognize voices. And it was heartbreaking because this is not what a child should have to be dealing with when they're at home. And for her to be able to explain this, it's very sad.
Okay, so this man, when he was screaming, what was he saying?
He was saying, "Candy, help me." He was screaming for help.
So he was screaming for your mom to help.
I'd help too. He just hit my little thing 2 times.
For me, the biggest heartbreak when I watched it was how much exposure does a child like this and her siblings have to violence in the household? Are they so used to this kind of violence that to them it's just another day where somebody's getting brutally murdered in this house? And so I still had a lot of questions, and the only way I can get an answer to these questions, I need to talk to Candy Dominguez. This woman walks in, very petite, very respectful, and she sat at the foot of the table. I sat on one side, and I began the interview. And I asked her, were you involved with this because you were forced to be involved, you were coerced into being involved with this? And she came right out and said no. And she immediately goes into this story that I did not expect. And I was absolutely shocked by it.
Well, after everybody left, the body just sat there for like a week. So then I told Daniel, something has to give. We have to do something because the body smells. You can smell it 3 blocks away from my house. You can smell the body. And he's like, I can't. I said, yes, you can. So we go to cut the body up into pieces because we're going to burn this body in the barbecue pit. That was the original plan. So he's looking there and he's standing there looking like, and I'm like, well, what are you waiting for? You know? And he's just standing there. So I go get some things and I cut up the body myself. I come back into the back house and I start cutting up the body. And I told him, well, do something at least, you know? This is your stuff. Like, pick up the pieces, do something. So he's laughing at me and he's like, I'm in love. And he picks up the pieces of the body and he's putting it in bags.
When I listen to this audio today, I can see that same attitude, that same person is still there. I was expecting a lot of tears, a lot of crying, a lot of fear and intimidation. Instead, I got this person who had absolutely no emotion, who had absolutely no remorse, who was at the verge of bragging about what occurred to her own cousin. There was clearly something there that made her want to say, look, this is who I am. This is what I did. Quite frankly, she scared me. I mean, she sat there and calmly talked about how she dismembered a human body and was almost proud to say that this is not the first time she has done this. Candy Dominguez is part of the Mexican mafia lifestyle. In her interview, she went as far as to explain that she disposes of body parts for cartels in Mexico. And this is not a lifestyle that is easily rehabilitated from. She still has no emotion. She still has no remorse for what occurred in her home to her cousin in an area that was in close proximity to her children. So Candy Dominguez, 100%, is still a dangerous individual.
A lot of people will say I'm very cold, but I'm definitely not evil. I miss my cousin. I do feel sorry. I feel bad that I participated in taking his life, because no matter which way his life was going, it was still his life. But, you know, this was never nothing personal. I didn't expect everything to happen the way it did. It was not planned. It just happened. I've always been cold. I'm not emotional, and that's not because I'm trying. It's just over the years as a kid, I turned my emotions off and I never turned them back on. Even as a kid, I was not emotional. I didn't cry. I never have. It was a way of surviving, because the streets don't love nobody. They don't take care of nobody. I became emotionally cut off. I was numb most of the time. Like, I was just living. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't feeling. I was about 8 years old, and I had run away from home, and I was staying at a house, and the girl's house I was staying at, her family was in the cartel, and that's how I became involved. And as I got older, it was a choice to stay around them. The most gruesome thing I saw involving the cartel was when they skinned a man alive. Yes. And then they beheaded him and hung him from the highway. As far as disposing of bodies, you don't gotta learn, you just watch. If you're just quiet, you can watch a lot of things. But when I had my kids, I knew for sure that was a lifestyle I didn't want to be a part of. And that lifestyle I walked away from when I was a teenager. But when I met Daniel, it just took right back to it, you know?
My impression of the relationship between Daniel and Candy was one of control. She was a perfect victim for him.
She wanted somebody that was a bad boy, and she found him, and it was obvious to me that he just totally took over her. You know, she's somebody that you need to be afraid of.
I did believe he was gonna kill me. Because, you know, I had already heard that he killed his ex-girlfriend, and I had already heard a lot of stuff. So I was like, his threats clearly are not empty if his girlfriend before me was dead, you know? But when he said he was gonna kill me that first time, I said, okay, fine. So then he's like, you're not gonna run or cry? I'm really gonna kill you, you didn't hear me? But I looked at Daniel, and I laughed in his face. And then he did a double take, and he called me a crazy bitch. And he didn't kill me. So I was like, whatever, you know? So, no. I didn't try to stop Daniel. Could I have? I probably could have, because I had a good influence over him. But either way, I can't blame Daniel for being in the situation I'm in, because I made a choice to be there with him, to help him. And I'm sorry I'm not very emotional about it. I'm not gonna put crocodile tears on to appease anybody, you know?
Were you afraid of him?
I was not afraid of him. Most definitely I was not. He's hot-tempered, he's hot-headed, but he's a very caring person. He's got a loving heart. I never expected to have what I had with Daniel. What I had with him, I never felt with nobody. And no matter what we did, that connection with him is still there, you know? Daniel was my first love. My first and my last. Maybe my last.
When was the last time you wrote to Daniel?
Well, we're not supposed to have any contact with each other, actually. But let's see, the last time I wrote to Daniel was about, what are we in March? About 8 months ago. But I don't even know if he ever got it or not, so, but I'm pretty sure he did.
A relationship with Candy is just, people could think what they want, you know what I'm saying? I just knew Candy for a little short amount of time, so I didn't really get to know her. And I didn't really see her like a, like a serious relationship. But yeah, she used to write me all the time. She still tries to reach out, like, yeah, she sent me a JPEG through somebody, I think her daughter or somebody else. And she put, I love you and Candy or whatever. But I just laugh and throw that shit away. I don't got nothing for her, you know what I'm saying? At the end of the day, I got fucked over or whatever, how you want to say it. That's how I see it. But I don't see her laughing because she got 30 years. Me personally, I take responsibility for the lifestyle I chose, not for this murder, but the lifestyle I chose. If you're not living that lifestyle, you wouldn't be put in that situation, right? Because everybody wants to be like, oh, they want that clout, they want fortune, fame, everybody wants a badass drug dealer-ass boyfriend to take care of them. But at the end of the day, everything comes with a price, you know what I'm saying? Everything comes with a price.
I killed my wife, but I'm not gonna harm anyone. I've changed.
Why should people trust you?
They have to see. That's the next chapter.
You know, so many people have lost their lives just out of this one case alone.
How did this guy get out to do it again?
He thought I betrayed him, and we went at it, and he died.
I had a metal baseball bat. When he dropped, I started kicking him.
This was a brutal, brutal beating.
Anybody injured?
Yeah, there's a guy laying on the street.
His friend's eyes get big, like, fuck all that. I knock him out too. I'm not sitting here saying I'm innocent. I'm not. But to die like this is beyond me, though.
It's so horrific to even visualize blood all over them. You're gonna have to stop.
It's hard for me to feel this sense of guilt because I feel justified.
The case remains officially unsolved. Boulder police describe it as an open homicide investigation and state that they continue reviewing evidence and working with outside partners. While past public milestones include the 2008 DNA-based letter from then District Attorney Mary Lacey stating the Ramsey family should not be treated as suspects, and the still contested 1999 grand jury actions that did not lead to prosecution. City of Boulder 1. Part 4. Identifying the perpetrator. In most true crime stories, this is the section where the fog begins to lift. The camera moves closer to a name. The scattered clues become a pattern. A witness remembers something small. A lab result comes back with a match. A suspect's alibi cracks. A detective, exhausted and quiet under fluorescent light, sees the one detail that was hiding in plain sight. But in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, the section called Identifying the Perpetrator must begin with an absence. No court has named her killer. No conviction has carried her case into the settled language of legal history. The official record still holds the case open, and that openness is not an empty technicality. It is the central wound. To write about identifying the perpetrator in this case is not to announce a person. It is to walk through the long, painful process by which investigators, prosecutors, experts, journalists, family members, and the public tried to force a name out of evidence that would not fully yield. It is to understand how a case can be crowded with suspects and still remain unresolved. It is to study how certainty can be manufactured by emotion, how doubt can survive even strong suspicion, and how the face of a 6-year-old child can become trapped between competing narratives so powerful that the truth itself seems to recede behind them. The first possible perpetrator was not a person but a concept, the intruder. The ransom note, on its surface, introduced outsiders. It claimed a kidnapping, suggested organized threat, and demanded money. If taken at face value, it pointed away from the family and toward someone beyond the house. Someone who had entered the Ramsey home with a plan, or at least with enough confidence to write, wait, move, and leave. The intruder theory had a chilling shape. It imagined a person watching the family, knowing their routines, perhaps entering while they were away on Christmas night, perhaps hiding in the home as the family returned, perhaps moving through the rooms while the house slept. This figure would have known or discovered the layout, reached JonBenet, controlled her, killed her, and left behind a note that delayed the discovery of her body or misdirected the investigation. It is a terrifying possibility because it violates one of the deepest assumptions of domestic life: that walls and locks separate the family from the unknown. For investigators who considered this path, the house became a hunting ground. Doors, windows, basement access, marks, footprints, and possible points of entry had to be examined not only for what they showed but for what they failed to show. The basement window received particular attention over the years, partly because former Detective Lou Smith, brought into the case later, became one of the most prominent voices arguing that an intruder could have entered or exited through it. Smith's presence changed the moral and investigative atmosphere. He was not a tabloid speculator. He had experience, seriousness, and the calm persistence of someone accustomed to homicide work. When he looked at the Ramsey evidence, he did not see only staging. He saw signs that, in his view, could point to an outsider, the possibility of entry, the unidentified DNA, the nature of the ligature, and other physical details he believed had been misunderstood or too quickly dismissed. In a case dominated early by suspicion of the family, Smith's intruder theory gave the public another path and gave the Ramseys a forceful defender from within the law enforcement world. But even that theory did not identify a perpetrator. It identified a category, a shadow with no confirmed face. The shadow remained compelling because it solved some emotional problems while creating practical ones. It allowed the family to remain victims without suspicion. But it required an offender bold enough to spend dangerous time inside an occupied home. It explained unknown DNA more easily than family theories did. But it struggled with the note's unusual length, its connection to materials in the house, and the offender's apparent comfort in the home. Every time the intruder theory seemed to move toward clarity, it encountered the same question. Who exactly was this person, and where is the evidence tying him unmistakably to the crime? Without that name, the intruder remained a presence built from possibility. Possibility is important in investigation, but possibility cannot stand in court as proof. The second possible perpetrator, in the minds of many early investigators, was not one outsider, but someone within the immediate family environment. This was the theory that turned the Ramsey case into a cultural storm. It was not enough for investigators to ask whether the family knew more than they said. They had to decide whether the evidence justified treating grieving parents as potential participants in their daughter's death. To understand how this suspicion formed, one must return to the first contradictions, the body found inside the home. The ransom note apparently written on materials from within the house, the lack of a cleanly obvious abduction path. The note's reference to money associated with John Ramsey, the early contamination of the scene, and the family's legal defensiveness. These details did not prove guilt, but they created an investigative pressure that pressed inward. Patsy Ramsey's handwriting became a major point of inquiry. Experts studied samples, compared forms, weighed similarities and differences, and produced opinions that were interpreted differently depending on who was reading them. The public often treats handwriting analysis as if it can produce a clear yes or no. But in practice, it often operates in degrees, cannot eliminate probable, unlikely, inconclusive, identification, exclusion. In John Vinay's case, the handwriting issue became a dangerous half-light. To those already suspicious of Patsy, the fact that she was not definitively excluded seemed damning. To those defending her, the lack of definitive identification meant that suspicion was being inflated into accusation. That conflict reveals one of the central problems in identifying the perpetrator. Evidence that is not conclusive can still become emotionally conclusive to the public. Patsy's style, her pageant background, her dramatic presence, and her cancer survivor history all became entangled with theories about motive and cover-up. Some imagined an accident and panic, some imagined rage. Some imagined a staging scenario so elaborate that the ransom note became the key to everything. Yet none of those theories crossed the legal threshold. No prosecutor stood in court and proved that Patsy Ramsey wrote the note or killed her daughter. She died in 2006 without the case being resolved, leaving behind both grief and suspicion that the legal system never answered. John Ramsey's place in the identification process was equally complicated, but differently shaped. He was the one whose business success made the ransom amount significant to investigators and commentators. He was the one who discovered the body in the basement room and carried John Vinay upstairs. He was the father whose composure was read by some as shock and by others as control. Family involvement theories sometimes cast him as participant, protector, or cover-up figure, depending on the version. But again, the movement from suspicion to identification never occurred. There was no conviction, no confession, no reliable forensic match tying him as killer. And later DNA-centered developments were used by some officials to move the Ramseys away from the suspect category. The difficulty is that public memory often refuses to update cleanly. Once suspicion attaches to a face, it can survive even when the legal case does not. John Ramsey spent the decades after his daughter's death living not only as a bereaved father, but as a man continually questioned in the court of public opinion, while also becoming one of the most visible advocates for renewed DNA testing and further investigation. To some, that advocacy suggested innocence and endurance. To others, suspicion persisted because the first narrative had gone too deep. In the absence of a named perpetrator, every later action was forced to carry symbolic weight. Burke Ramsey's name became entangled in public theories in a particularly painful way. He was a child when his sister died, and any serious examination of the case must treat that fact as morally important. Investigators had reason to interview him because he was in the house. But the public's later fascination with him crossed into something harsher than investigative necessity. Theories involving Burke often relied on childhood behavior, family dynamics, imagined accidents, and interpretations of interviews many years later. He became, for some theory builders, a way to reconcile the idea of a family cover-up with the emotional difficulty of imagining a parent as the direct killer. But the same problem remained. Speculation is not identification. No legal authority has convicted Burke Ramsey of killing his sister. He has denied involvement, and he pursued defamation actions in response to public accusations. The fact that his name entered the public arena at all demonstrates how an unresolved case can widen its damage. The original victim was John Benet, but the uncertainty created secondary injuries, pulling living people into decades of suspicion without the closure of proof. Identifying a perpetrator requires more than constructing a possible story. It requires evidence strong enough to survive alternative explanations. In the Ramsey case, alternative explanations multiplied around every suspect. If one looked inward, the DNA complicated the view. If one looked outward, the note complicated the view. If one focused on the body, questions of staging, sequence, and offender behavior complicated the view. If one focused on the house, the issue of access complicated the view. The investigation became less like a lock waiting for the right key and more like a set of locks that seemed to accept several keys halfway before jamming. This is why certain names outside the family periodically rose into public awareness, only to collapse or fade. One of the most dramatic was John Mark Carr, the former teacher who emerged in 2006 with a confession that briefly electrified the world. The timing was brutal. Patsy Ramsey had died of ovarian cancer only months earlier, never seeing a resolution. Then suddenly a man in Thailand appeared to offer what the public had been waiting for, a voice claiming responsibility. The media moved quickly because confession carries a powerful charge. It promises an end to ambiguity. It gives cameras a face. It allows headlines to breathe the word breakthrough. But serious investigation is not satisfied by confession alone, especially in a famous case where facts have circulated for years. Carr's statements did not hold. He was not charged in the murder. Reports placed him elsewhere at the time, and DNA did not tie him to the crime. The confession that seemed, for a moment, to offer identification became instead another example of the Ramsey case's ability to attract false clarity. It was a cruel pattern. A name rises, the public leans in, and then the evidence withdraws. Carr's false or unsupported confession did more than waste time. It revealed how desperate the culture had become for an ending. People wanted the relief of a perpetrator, even if the evidence could not support it. Other possible suspects came and went with less global drama but similar uncertainty. People connected to the pageant world were examined. People who had worked in or around the Ramsey home were examined. People with criminal histories were examined. Neighbors, acquaintances, and individuals named in tips entered investigative files. Some had opportunity but no forensic connection. Some had troubling backgrounds but no proven access. Some made suspicious statements but could not be placed in the house. Some were tested and excluded. Some became subjects of public discussion far beyond what the evidence warranted. In a case as famous as John Benet's, suspicion became almost viral. A person did not need to be strongly linked to the crime to become part of the mythology. A strange photograph, a prior offense, a connection to pageants, a rumor about employment. A statement overheard by someone else, any fragment could become the seed of a theory. Investigators had to move through those fragments with discipline. But the public did not always share that discipline. The internet allowed amateur detectives to assemble names, timelines, maps, and accusations, sometimes with genuine care, sometimes with reckless confidence. This created a second investigative world, parallel to the official one, where the perpetrator could be identified again and again by people with no power to test evidence and no responsibility for the lives they damaged. DNA became the most important hope for a true identification because it appeared to offer what the rest of the case lacked, a way to move beyond interpretation. The unidentified male DNA found in evidence connected to JonBenét's clothing became a turning point in how some officials viewed the case. In 2008, then District Attorney Mary Lacy sent a letter stating that DNA results supported clearing the Ramsey family from suspicion. That letter became one of the most consequential documents in the public history of the case. For the Ramseys and their supporters, it was an overdue recognition that the family had been wrongly targeted. For others, it was controversial because questions remained about the nature, quantity, and meaning of the DNA. Was it from the killer? Was it transferred innocently through manufacturing, handling, or contamination? Did it represent one person clearly enough? Could it be relied upon to exclude the family from all possible involvement? Forensic DNA can be powerful, but it is not automatically self-explanatory. Its meaning depends on where it was found, how much was found, whether it appears in multiple locations, whether it is consistent with violent contact, and whether contamination can be reasonably ruled out. The Ramsey DNA evidence has therefore functioned as both hope and dispute. If the unknown profile belongs to the killer, then identifying that person could solve the case. If it does not, then treating it as decisive could mislead the investigation. This tension keeps DNA at the center of the identification process, but also prevents it from delivering closure by itself. Modern genetic genealogy has transformed some cold cases, taking tiny biological traces and moving through family trees until a suspect emerges from decades of silence. For families of victims, this technology can feel almost miraculous. It has named people who once seemed unreachable. It has corrected old failures and given detectives new routes through abandoned files. In the Ramsey case, the possibility of advanced testing has become a recurring source of pressure and hope. John Ramsey and other family advocates have urged authorities to use every available method. Boulder police have stated publicly that the investigation remains active and that they continue working with DNA experts and outside partners. Yet hope must be handled honestly. Genetic genealogy depends on the quality and quantity of DNA, the nature of the profile, database availability, legal permissions, and whether the sample is truly connected to the perpetrator. It is not a spell cast over old evidence. It is a tool, and like all tools, it can only work with what the case gives it. If the sample is too small, mixed, degraded, contaminated, or not probative, the technology may not produce the answer the public wants. Still, the fact that DNA remains a focus nearly 3 decades later shows that identification is not impossible in principle. It simply has not happened in a way that law enforcement can announce with confidence. The 1999 grand jury action occupies a strange place in the story of identification. A grand jury reportedly voted on charges against John and Patsy Ramsey, but the district attorney at the time did not sign and prosecute the indictments, citing insufficient evidence. Years later, when parts of those documents became public, the effect was explosive because they seemed to show that a panel had believed the parents bore criminal responsibility in some form. But even here, the word perpetrator remains unstable. The released language did not produce a trial verdict. It did not prove who physically killed JonBenet. It did not result in a jury hearing a full adversarial case with cross-examination and defense evidence. It revealed probable cause thinking, not legal finality. To many members of the public, that distinction felt unsatisfying, almost evasive. But the distinction is the backbone of criminal law. A grand jury may hear enough to authorize an accusation, while a prosecutor may still conclude that a conviction beyond reasonable doubt is unlikely. In this case, the grand jury development deepened the divide because it seemed to identify responsibility without identifying the killer in the only way that could close the case. It added another layer of unresolved accusation, another piece of the puzzle that points strongly in one direction for some observers and remains legally incomplete for others. The search for the perpetrator also became a search for motive, and motive in this case has always been elusive. If an intruder killed JonBenet, why write such a long note? Was the motive sexual, financial, personal, sadistic, obsessive, or a mixture. If the crime began as a kidnapping plan, why leave the body in the house? If it began as an assault, why create a ransom note? If the family was involved, what event triggered the violence? Was there an accident? A confrontation? A hidden pattern? Why the elaborate staging? Why the specific amount of money? Why the physical manner of death? Every motive theory requires the mind of the offender to behave in a particular way, and in the Ramsey case, the offender's behavior seems contradictory no matter which suspect category is chosen. A rational kidnapper would not usually leave the victim behind. A panic stager might not usually write such a lengthy note. A stranger would risk extraordinary exposure inside the house. A family member would risk creating an elaborate fiction under crushing emotional pressure. The crime has the strange quality of being both intimate and theatrical. That combination makes the perpetrator hard to imagine clearly. The person who killed JonBenet did not leave behind a simple emotional signature. They left behind a scene that seemed to borrow from multiple types of crime at once: abduction, domestic tragedy, sexualized violence, staging, ransom, concealment. This blending is one reason the case resists identification. Investigators often rely on behavioral consistency. Here, consistency itself is disputed. The crime scene appeared to say too many things at the same time. In the years after Mary Lacy's 2008 letter, the Ramsey family's public position strengthened around the belief that an unidentified intruder killed JonBenet and that DNA would eventually prove it. Yet the broader investigative and journalistic world did not fully settle there. Some experts questioned whether the DNA was strong enough to clear anyone. Some former investigators continued to believe the family-focused theories had been too quickly softened by later public relations and legal developments. Others argued that early tunnel vision toward the family had cost the investigation its chance to identify an outsider. This is the tragedy of divided interpretation. Each side accuses the other not merely of being wrong, but of helping the killer escape. If investigators focused too heavily on the Ramseys, an intruder may have walked away while leads cooled. If officials later leaned too heavily on ambiguous DNA, possible family responsibility may have been buried under a premature exoneration. The case becomes, in this sense, a moral labyrinth. Every path contains the fear that choosing it means abandoning another path where the truth might live. The perpetrator, whoever that person is, benefited from this division, whether by design or luck. The killer left behind a case that fractured the people responsible for solving it. Publicly, the question who killed JonBenet Ramsey became almost inseparable from another question: who failed JonBenet Ramsey? The killer failed her in the most direct and unforgivable way. But others, intentionally or not, may have failed her afterward. Police failed to secure the scene with the rigor later needed. Prosecutors and police failed to maintain a united front. Media outlets failed to protect the dignity of a murdered child and the fairness of unproven suspects. The public failed when curiosity became cruelty. These failures do not identify the perpetrator, but they explain how identification became harder. In homicide work, truth is fragile at first. It must be protected before it can be interpreted. In Boulder, truth was exposed to too much movement, too much noise, too much theory, too much television. By the time official identification became the central demand, the case had already become a national possession. Everyone thought they had a claim on it. JonBenet herself had the only claim that mattered, and she could not speak. If there is a future identification, it will likely come not from the loudest theory, but from disciplined evidence work. DNA testing that connects an unknown profile to a real person. A witness whose information can be independently verified. A preserved item that yields new forensic meaning. Or a confession supported by details never publicly known. It will not be enough for someone to sound plausible. It will not be enough for a theory to feel emotionally satisfying. The case has survived too many false endings for that. Any true identification must pass through the narrow door that has rejected every previous certainty, proof. It must explain the note, the body, the timing, the house, the DNA, the movement through the basement, and the absence or presence of access. It must withstand the defense arguments created by decades of contamination, publicity, and alternative suspects. It must do more than name someone. It must carry JonBenét's story out of speculation and into justice. Until that happens, the perpetrator remains both everywhere and nowhere in the case record. They're in the handwriting debates and not in them. They're in the DNA and perhaps not in it. They're in the basement and the note and the broken trust between police and prosecutors. They're in every suspect file that closed without charge. They're in every false confession that briefly stole attention. They are in every anniversary statement promising continued effort. They're in the silence that follows the question after all the theories are exhausted. This is not satisfying storytelling, but it is honest storytelling. A responsible script cannot invent the certainty the courts never produced. It cannot take a child's unresolved murder and force it into the shape of a solved case for the comfort of narrative closure. Part 4, then, ends not with the face of a perpetrator, but with the outline of the failure to identify one. The investigation tried to find the killer in the family, in the world outside the house, in handwriting, in behavioral clues, in access points, in DNA, in confessions, in grand jury evidence, in old files, in new testing, in every place a truth might hide. Again and again, the answer seemed near enough to touch, then slipped away. What remains is the most painful kind of identification, not the naming of the person responsible, but the clear recognition of what that person escaped. They escaped the first morning's confusion. They escaped the fracture between theories. They escaped the glare of fame by hiding inside it. They escaped while JonBenét's image became famous and her killer remained faceless. The work of identifying that person continues because a child's death cannot be allowed to dissolve into debate forever. Somewhere behind the note, behind the basement door, behind the years of accusation and denial, there was a human being who made choices in the dark. That person was not a theory. That person had hands, breath, fear or coldness, knowledge or luck. That person left a 6-year-old girl behind and allowed the world to tear itself apart trying to understand what they had done. Until evidence gives that person a name, the case remains suspended between memory and justice. And JonBené Ramsey remains not only the victim of a murder, but the center of one of the most haunting failures of identification in modern American criminal history. Part 5 is grounded in the official status of the case as an open homicide investigation, the public record that no one has been convicted, the 1999 grand jury action that did not result in prosecution, and the 2008 DNA-based letter from then District Attorney Mary Lacy stating that the Ramsey family should not be considered suspects. City of Boulder 1. Part 5, Trial and Verdict, Justice, Reflection, and Conclusion, Consequences. In the story of JonBené Ramsey, the courtroom never became the final stage. There was no packed gallery where a defendant sat beneath the weight of the evidence. No jury returning with a verdict that made the country hold its breath. No judge reading a sentence into the formal silence of the law. The case had almost every ingredient of a trial America would have watched obsessively: wealth, grief, suspicion, forensic dispute, a strange ransom note, a child's pageant images, institutional conflict, and a crime scene that seemed to resist closure. Yet the legal ending never arrived. That absence is the verdict the case has carried for decades. Not guilty. Not guilty. Not proven. Not charged. Not solved. These phrases are not the same. And the tragedy of the Ramsey case is that the public often confuse them, bending the law into emotional shapes it was never designed to hold. In law, there was no convicted killer. In public opinion, there were many. That is where the final section begins, not in a courtroom, but in the empty space where a courtroom should have been. After JonBenét's death, justice did not move forward with the clean authority people expect from serious homicide cases. It stumbled through investigative disagreement, forensic uncertainty, media pressure, and the heavy shadow of the first morning. The house had not been secured with the discipline later demanded by the evidence. The body had been moved. Friends had entered. Assumptions had shifted from kidnapping to homicide too late. Police and prosecutors did not share a single rhythm. Detectives believed one thing, prosecutors feared another, and the family lived behind lawyers, cameras, grief, and suspicion. When a case reaches court, the legal system tries to impose order on chaos. Witnesses are called in sequence. Evidence is admitted or excluded. Experts explain. Attorneys challenge. Jurors deliberate. But the Ramsey case never reached that structure, and so its evidence remained in the wild. Argued over in books, television specials, newsrooms, internet forums, and living rooms. Without trial, there was no official public testing of the case as a whole. Instead, there were fragments. A ransom note here. A DNA profile there. A handwriting opinion. A grand jury report. A documentary. A police interview. A lawsuit. A retired detective's theory. A district attorney's letter. Each fragment stood alone long enough for people to build worlds around it. The law, cautious and incomplete, left a vacuum. The media filled it. The grand jury came closest to becoming the legal turning point. In 1999, after months of hearing evidence, the grand jury voted on indictments involving John and Patsy Ramsey. But then District Attorney Alex Hunter did not sign and prosecute them because he did not believe the evidence could support proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction, dry as it sounds, is one of the most important in the entire case. Probable cause is not conviction. Suspicion is not proof. A grand jury hears from prosecutors in a closed process and does not operate like a full trial with the same adversarial balance. A trial requires the state to stand in open court and prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt under cross-examination, before jurors who must be convinced not by instinct but by admissible evidence. Hunter's decision not to prosecute frustrated many people then and later. To some, it looked like hesitation, weakness, or protection of a wealthy family. To others, it looked like legal realism. An acknowledgement that a flawed investigation and contested evidence could collapse under the weight of a defense. Years later, when parts of the grand jury documents were released, the public was given just enough to reopen old wounds, not enough to heal them. Those who suspected the Ramseys saw validation. Those who defended them saw a failed accusation that never deserved to become a conviction. The documents did not create justice. They created another chamber of echo. The absence of trial meant there was no verdict. And the absence of verdict meant consequences spread unevenly. For the Ramsey family, the first consequence was grief under suspicion. It is difficult enough for a family to lose a child to violence. It is another kind of suffering to lose that child and then become a national object of accusation. Patsy Ramsey, already a cancer survivor before John Benet's death, lived the remainder of her life inside that pressure. Her face became part of the case's visual vocabulary, the pageant mother, the grieving mother, the suspicious mother, the defended mother, depending on who was watching. Her voice, clothing, expressions, handwriting, and history were examined with a harshness usually reserved for defendants, even though she was never convicted of anything related to her daughter's death. When she died in 2006 from ovarian cancer, she died without seeing a legal resolution, without hearing a court name her daughter's killer, and without escaping the shadow that public suspicion had placed over her. Whether one believes she was unfairly targeted or incompletely investigated, the human consequence remains stark. A mother's life after the murder was consumed by a case that never delivered the clarity of either conviction or full public exoneration in the minds of all observers. John Ramsey carried the case differently. With a businessman's steadiness that some viewed as endurance and others continued to read with suspicion. He lost a daughter, endured public accusation, lost Patsy, and continued pressing for renewed DNA testing and outside review. His later advocacy became part of the case's ongoing life. To supporters, he became the father refusing to let the system forget. To skeptics, every public appearance was absorbed into older suspicions. In an unresolved case, even the pursuit of answers can be interpreted through the theory people already hold. If he asked for testing, some saw innocence, others saw strategy. If he criticized Boulder police, some saw righteous frustration, others saw deflection. This is one of the cruelties of unresolved suspicion. It turns every act into evidence for someone. A solved case ends that interpretive fever. An unsolved one allows it to burn for decades. Burke Ramsey's consequence was perhaps the most quietly disturbing because he was a child when the crime occurred. He grew up with the death of his sister behind him and public curiosity around him. Later theories, interviews, and media programs brought his name into the spotlight in ways that show how the search for truth can become morally careless when the public is hungry. A child surviving trauma does not owe strangers a normal expression. An adult who grew up inside a famous tragedy does not owe television viewers the performance of comfort. Burke's later legal actions against public accusations reflected the damage caused when speculation hardens into broadcast claim. The justice system never convicted him. The culture, at times, behaved as if it had the right to try him anyway. The consequences for law enforcement were equally enduring. Boulder police became permanently associated with the early handling of the Ramsey scene. Every anniversary revived the criticism. The house was not properly sealed. People moved through it. The body was discovered by John Ramsey rather than by officers during a comprehensive search. And the transition from kidnapping to homicide came too late to preserve the scene as cleanly as needed. Some of this criticism is fair. Some of it is sharpened by hindsight. Officers responding at dawn to a reported kidnapping of a 6-year-old inside an affluent, emotionally chaotic home faced a rare and disorienting situation. Yet serious cases are judged not only by the difficulty of the moment, but by the consequences of decisions made inside that difficulty. Evidence once contaminated cannot be made pure again by later good intentions. The Ramsey case became a training wound, a reminder whispered through later investigations. Control the scene, protect the evidence, do not allow grief to erase procedure. Do not let the first theory blind the response to other possibilities. The cost of those lessons was John Benet's case itself. The district attorney's office faced its own legacy. Alex Hunter was criticized for caution and for a perceived reluctance to prosecute. Mary Lacy was criticized by some for her 2008 DNA-based letter stating that the Ramsey family should not be under suspicion. Both offices, in different eras, stood at the intersection of evidence and public demand. Prosecutors are often attacked for not giving the public what it wants, but their burden is not public satisfaction. Their burden is a case that can be proven. Yet the Ramsey case also shows how caution, when poorly explained or institutionally divided, can look like failure. The public rarely sees the full file. It sees outcomes. No arrest. No conviction. No named killer. Into that emptiness, people pour motives, incompetence, cowardice, corruption, privilege, tunnel vision. Some criticisms may hold truth. Others may be emotional attempts to make uncertainty feel less random. The legal consequence was a long erosion of trust. Many people stopped believing official statements, or believed them only when they supported a preferred theory. That erosion is dangerous because cold cases depend on trust. Witnesses must come forward. Families must cooperate. Agencies must share information. And the public must understand the difference between pressure and proof. The media consequences were enormous and still shape true crime culture today. John Benet's murder arrived at a moment when cable news, tabloid television, and celebrity criminal coverage were learning how to turn tragedy into recurring programming. Her pageant footage became endlessly replayable. The ransom note became endlessly discussable. Her parents became characters. Experts became recurring voices. The case taught media producers that an unsolved child murder could become content for years, even decades, if the imagery was strong enough and the mystery unresolved. That lesson has never disappeared. Modern true crime, from streaming documentaries to podcasts to online forums, still lives with the ethical questions the Ramsey case made impossible to ignore. When does attention help a case, and when does it exploit it? When does public pressure push authorities to act, and when does it poison fairness? When does remembering a victim become consuming her image? JonBenét's case sits at the center of those questions because the media did not merely cover her death. It shaped the way millions understood her life. The child beauty pageant footage, especially, became one of the most unsettling consequences. Those images were often presented as if they explained something essential about the crime. But they also risked reducing JonBenet to a symbol of adult discomfort. People debated whether the pageant sexualized her, whether Patsy pushed her too hard, whether the performances attracted danger, whether the costumes revealed something about the family's values. Some of those conversations were socially important because they forced America to look at child performance, beauty culture, parental ambition, and the adult gaze. But they also shifted attention away from the simplest fact: JonBenet was a murdered child. She was not responsible for the world adults built around her. She was not responsible for the costumes chosen for her, the cameras pointed at her, the competitions entered, the images replayed after her death, or the theories strangers attached to them. The ethical task in telling her story is to let those images be part of the background without letting them consume the person. A victim is not a clue simply because she was photographed. A child's smile on stage does not explain the violence done to her in a basement. The consequence for Boulder was quieter but lasting. The city, proud of its mountain beauty and cultivated safety, became linked to a crime that contradicted its self-image. Boulder did not become dangerous because of JonBenét's murder, but it became symbolically vulnerable. The case exposed that even a prosperous, educated, scenic community could mishandle horror. It showed that good neighborhoods are not immune to violence, and that institutional confidence can falter when confronted with an event outside ordinary expectations. For residents, the Ramsey house became an unwanted landmark, a place people recognized for the worst reason. True crime geography has a strange afterlife. Homes become sites of curiosity. Streets become searchable. Communities become backdrops. But for the people who live there, the crime is not content, it is part of the local air. Boulder has had to carry the case as both history and open wound. A story outsiders revisit while the city continues with ordinary life, students walking to class, snow melting on sidewalks, restaurants opening for dinner, families decorating for holidays under the same mountains that watched the morning of December 26th. The broader consequence for justice is more troubling. The Ramsey case became an example of how a murder can remain unresolved not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence is damaged, disputed, or insufficiently decisive. People often imagine cold cases as empty rooms waiting for a clue. JonBenét's case is the opposite. It is crowded. There are reports, interviews, lab results, photographs, expert opinions, timelines, books, documentaries, lawsuits, and official statements. The problem is not silence. The problem is too much noise around signals that never aligned conclusively. This distinction matters because it teaches a hard truth. More information does not always create more clarity. Sometimes more information creates more theory. Sometimes every new detail gives one side confidence and the other side doubt. Justice requires not only facts, but the ability to arrange facts into proof. In this case, proof has remained elusive. The 2008 DNA-related development offered a form of legal and moral relief to the Ramsey family when Mary Lacy wrote that the immediate family should not be treated as suspects, but that, too, did not end the case. It did not name an intruder. It did not bring a defendant to trial. It did not settle disputes among experts about the meaning of the DNA. It did not erase the grand jury history. It did not stop public debate. It changed the official posture, but it did not deliver the final justice JonBenet needed. This is another painful lesson. Exoneration, partial exoneration, or official apology does not equal solution. A family may be relieved of suspicion, yet still be left without the person who killed their child. A case may shift direction, yet still remain cold. The unidentified DNA profile, if truly connected to the perpetrator, remains a possible path through the darkness. If not, it remains another unresolved fragment. Either way, it stands as a reminder that modern science can extend hope without guaranteeing closure. The false confession by John Mark Carr in 2006 became one of the case's cruelest episodes because it briefly simulated justice. For a moment, the world saw a man's name and believed perhaps the story had reached the missing courtroom after all. But the evidence did not support the confession. He was not charged in JonBenet's murder. The moment collapsed, leaving behind embarrassment, frustration, and renewed grief. False confessions are not merely investigative detours, they are emotional theft. They steal attention from the victim, steal hope from families, and steal time from detectives. In famous cases, they also reveal something unsettling about human psychology. Some people are drawn to the center of tragedy even if they have no place there. They would rather be hated inside a famous story than unknown outside it. JonBenet's case, because it was so visible, attracted that kind of distortion. The consequence was another reminder that not every answer that arrives dramatically is true. Justice is not drama. Justice is proof. For Patsy Ramsey, justice never came in life. For John Ramsey, it remains something pursued through public advocacy and appeals for testing. For Burke, justice would also mean freedom from reckless accusation. For Boulder police, justice would mean solving the case that has shadowed the department for a generation. For the public, justice would mean the end of an obsession. But perhaps also the loss of a mystery some have become too comfortable consuming. That is an uncomfortable thought, but a necessary one. Unsolved cases create communities of attention. People gather around them, study them, argue them, build identities as believers in one theory or another. The victim becomes the center of a wheel that keeps turning. If the case is solved, the wheel stops or slows. Some people genuinely want justice. Others, whether they admit it or not, want the mystery to continue because the mystery gives them something to chase. JonBenet deserved better than to become an endless puzzle. She deserved the ordinary future stolen from her: school years, awkward adolescence, private failures, private joys, a life beyond photographs and theories. Reflection must return to that theft. The most haunting consequence of the Ramsey case is not that America became obsessed. It is that obsession did not save her, did not quickly identify her killer, and often did not protect her dignity. The cameras that replayed her pageant smile could not restore her voice. The panels that argued over her parents could not undo the first morning's mistakes. The books that promised revelations could not bring a verdict. The internet threads that mapped the house could not stand in for evidence. The case became permanent, but permanence is not justice. A name remembered forever is not the same as a life honored properly. To honor JonBenet properly means holding two commitments at once: to tell the truth as far as the record allows, and to refuse false certainty where the record does not. It means saying plainly that a 6-year-old child was killed, that the investigation was damaged early, that suspicion fell heavily on her family, that no one was convicted, that DNA evidence later shifted official treatment of the Ramseys. That debate continues, and that the case remains open. It means not turning unresolved pain into entertainment without conscience. It means remembering that every theory has human costs. Accusing the wrong person is not a harmless pastime. Defending a theory by ignoring evidence is not justice. Treating a murdered child as a brand is not remembrance. The Ramsey case also changed how people think about victim imagery. Before her death, JonBenét's pageant photographs were family and competition images, part of a small world of performance. After her death, they became public property in practice, though never morally. They were used to create mood, suspicion, pity, outrage. Her face became instantly recognizable, yet recognition can be a shallow form of knowing. Millions recognized JonBenét, but they did not know what made her laugh when no camera was on. What frightened her, what ordinary habits made her family smile. What she would have become when the curls and costumes were left behind. The case froze her in a narrow set of images, and then asked those images to explain a murder. They could not. No photograph of a child can explain the adult violence around her. The conclusion of this script must therefore resist the easy ending. There is no gavel. There is no final verdict. There is no condemned killer looking back from the defense table. There is only the long aftermath, a family broken and scrutinized. A police department haunted by criticism, prosecutors shadowed by choices, a city marked by a crime. A media culture fed by mystery, and a public still arguing in the dark. Yet an unresolved ending is not the same as a meaningless one. The Ramsey case warns us about the fragility of first response, the danger of tunnel vision, the limits of behavioral judgment, the power and ambiguity of forensic science, and the ethical responsibility of true crime storytelling. It shows how justice can be delayed not by one failure alone, but by a chain of failures, each link tightening around the truth. It shows how a child's death can expose adult systems, law enforcement, media, family image, class, gender, beauty culture, and public appetite. It shows that sometimes the most famous cases are not the best understood. In the final image, return not to the pageant stage, not to the ransom note, not to the basement diagram, but to Boulder after Christmas. Imagine the cold air outside the house, the mountains standing unchanged. The decorations still bright in neighboring windows. The strange cruelty of ordinary life continuing beside catastrophe. A child had died inside a home that should have protected her. The world would learn her name, but learning her name was not enough. Justice would have required more. A protected scene, a clear trail, a responsible prosecution. A verdict supported by proof, a public willing to distinguish curiosity from care. Instead, JonBenet Ramsey became one of America's permanent questions. Her case remains a door left open in winter, letting in the cold year after year. And behind that door is the truth that every responsible telling must preserve. Before she was a mystery, before she was a headline, before she was a theory. She was a 6-year-old girl whose life mattered beyond the crime that ended it. The search for justice continues because that life mattered, and because somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the accusations, beyond the false endings and unfinished evidence, the person responsible still owes her the one thing the world has not yet been able to give, the truth spoken clearly enough to stand. Part 6 is written with the case's current public status in mind. Boulder police continue to list JonBenet Ramsey's murder as an open homicide investigation. And recent public updates report renewed evidence review, testing, and interviews without a named perpetrator or conviction. City of Boulder 1. Part 6. Final reflection, lasting consequences, and the unfinished search for truth. By the time the story of JonBenet Ramsey reaches its final part, the listener has already walked through the bright rooms of a Boulder Christmas. The panic of a missing child report, the impossible discovery in the basement, the long shadow of the ransom note, the suspicion that gathered around the family, the intruder theories that refused to disappear, the grand jury that did not become a trial, the DNA that offered hope but not a finished answer, and the media storm that turned a child's death into one of the most recognizable mysteries in American life. Yet a final part in this case cannot behave like a final chapter in a closed book. It cannot place the truth neatly on the table and turn off the lights. It must remain awake in the same uneasy way the case has remained awake for decades. It must look not only at what happened, but at what the years after the murder did to everyone who came near it. The consequences of JonBenet Ramsey's death did not stop at the basement door. They moved outward in rings, through the family, through Boulder, through policing, through journalism, through the true crime industry, through the public imagination, and through the private places where grief survives after cameras leave. The first and most permanent consequence was the absence of JonBenet herself. That is the truth easiest to say and hardest to keep centered. The world became fascinated by the mystery. But the mystery began with a little girl being taken from life before she could become anything beyond childhood. She did not live long enough to outgrow the pageant dresses. She did not live long enough to decide whether the stage belonged to her or to the adults who loved watching her on it. She did not live long enough to become embarrassed by old photographs, to argue with her parents as a teenager, to form her own opinions about the world, to make mistakes large enough to become stories at family dinners, to leave Boulder, to return to it, to become ordinary in the beautiful way adulthood allows a person to become ordinary. Instead, she was frozen at 6. And the world used that frozen image again and again until the living child behind it was almost buried beneath repetition. In the end, the most respectful way to tell her story is not to treat her as a puzzle, but as a person whose future was stolen. Every clue matters because she mattered. Every investigative failure matters because she mattered. Every false certainty matters because it risks replacing her with somebody else's need to be right. The consequence for the Ramsey family was not simply grief, but grief under permanent observation. There are families who lose children and suffer in private, protected at least by the mercy of obscurity. The Ramseys were denied that mercy. From the beginning, their mourning unfolded under suspicion, and suspicion changes the shape of mourning. It makes every silence seem strategic, every statement seem rehearsed. Every tear seem insufficient or excessive, every legal decision seem like concealment, every interview seem like performance. John and Patsy Ramsey did not simply become bereaved parents in the public eye, they became figures in a national argument. To some, they were victims twice over. First of the killer, and then of investigators and media voices that focused too intensely on them. To others, they remained central to the unanswered questions because the crime occurred inside their home and because early evidence appeared, to many investigators, to pull suspicion inward. That unresolved split did lasting harm. It meant that the family could never inhabit a single public identity. They were mourners and suspects, advocates and accused, victims and possible villains, depending on who was speaking. The law never convicted them. And later official statements based on DNA evidence moved the family away from suspect status, but public suspicion is not governed by law. It has no judge, no rules of evidence, no burden of proof, and no final appeal. Once it attaches, it can remain like smoke in fabric long after the fire is gone. Patsy Ramsey's life after the murder became inseparable from that smoke. Her illness returned. Her daughter's death remained unsolved. Her own image stayed trapped in the glare, the pageant mother, the dramatic mother, the grieving mother. The mother people felt licensed to judge because they had seen her on television. When she died in 2006, she left behind no courtroom resolution. There was no final public moment where the real killer was named and the weight lifted. For those who believed in her innocence, her death felt like an additional injustice. A woman leaving the world still marked by accusations she had denied. For those who remained suspicious, her death closed one possible path to questioning forever. Either way, the case lost something when Patsy died, not the truth itself, perhaps, but one of the people who had stood closest to it. Death silenced her before the case could. John Ramsey continued to live with the case in a different posture, carrying grief into advocacy. Over the years, he pressed for more DNA testing, more outside review, more openness to modern forensic methods. His public role changed from father under suspicion to father demanding renewed investigation, though not everyone accepted that change in the same way. In an unsolved case, even advocacy becomes contested territory. The person asking for answers may be seen as courageous by one audience and manipulative by another. That is the cruel arithmetic of unresolved crime. The absence of proof turns every action into material for theory. For John, the search for justice has had to take place inside a world where many people already chose their conclusion years ago. Whether those conclusions were fair or not, they became part of the burden he carried. Burke Ramsey's consequence must be named with particular care. He was a child when his sister died. He was not responsible for the adult hunger that later surrounded his behavior, his interviews, his facial expressions, or his childhood memories. The public often forgets that children who survive family trauma may grow into adults whose emotional lives have been shaped by pressure no stranger can understand. They may appear awkward. They may avoid the subject. They may speak in ways that seem too flat or too strange to viewers trained by television to expect grief to look familiar. But trauma does not owe the public a recognizable performance. Burke became, at various points, part of speculative theories. And the attention around him shows how far true crime culture can drift from compassion when a case remains unresolved. It is one thing for investigators to interview a child present in a home where a homicide occurred. It is another for millions of adults to dissect that child years later as though awkwardness were evidence. The difference between investigation and consumption is one of the central moral lessons of this case. Boulder's consequence was institutional as much as emotional. The police department became tied to one of the most criticized crime scene responses in modern American history. Former officials and outside observers have repeatedly pointed to early mistakes. Insufficient control of the home, movement of people through the scene, assumptions shaped by the kidnapping report, and the discovery of the body by John Ramsey rather than through an immediate and complete police search. The department has continued to state that the case remains active and that evidence has been reviewed and tested with modern methods, including recent annual updates reporting new testing and interviews. Yet every renewed statement must speak over the echo of the first day. That is the burden of early error. A later investigation may become diligent, careful, and technologically advanced, but it cannot fully erase the damage done when the scene was young. Crime scenes age quickly. A fiber moved in the first hours cannot be restored to its original meaning decades later. A room crossed by too many people cannot become untouched again. A witness's first impressions cannot be recovered with the sharpness they had before television, lawyers, and fear-shaped memory. The Ramsey case became a cautionary tale for law enforcement because it shows that good intentions cannot substitute for control. A family in crisis needs compassion, but a murdered child needs evidence preserved with almost sacred discipline. The failure to balance those needs can cost a case its cleanest path to truth. The consequence for prosecutors was a different kind of shadow. A prosecutor does not simply ask what may have happened. A prosecutor must ask what can be proven in court. This distinction frustrates the public because the public often experiences true crime as narrative, while prosecutors must experience it as risk. A theory can be persuasive, emotionally coherent, even supported by troubling evidence, and still fail before the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In the Ramsey case, the grand jury's action and the decision not to prosecute created a wound that never fully closed. People who wanted charges saw caution as failure. People who feared wrongful prosecution saw restraint as necessary. Both reactions came from a desire for justice, but they imagined justice differently. One side believed justice required accusation before evidence disappeared further. The other believed justice required not bringing a case that could not be won fairly. The unresolved tension between those positions remains one of the case's defining legal consequences. The public learned, or should have learned, that justice is not the same as certainty felt in the body. It is a process with standards, and when those standards cannot be met, even the most famous victim may be left without a verdict. The media consequences may be the widest of all. JonBenét's murder became one of the cases that helped shape the modern true crime economy. It arrived at a time when cable news, tabloid television, and documentary storytelling were discovering the power of unresolved crime as serialized attention. Every anniversary became an opportunity. Every theory became a segment. Every newly released document became a headline. Her pageant footage offered visual material that producers could use instantly to create emotional contrast. The glittering child and the dark basement, the crown and the cord, Christmas morning and the autopsy report. That contrast was powerful, but power is not innocence. The more the images were used, the more the child risked becoming an emblem rather than a human being. True crime creators have inherited this problem. A victim's image can draw attention, and attention can help keep a case alive, but attention can also consume. It can reward the most dramatic theory rather than the most responsible one. It can make people feel informed when they are only familiar with repeated symbols. It can transform a family's worst day into a genre. JonBenét's case asks every storyteller a hard question. Are you bringing the victim closer to dignity? Or are you using her pain to hold the audience a little longer? The answer lies not only in tone but in discipline. A responsible telling does not pretend a theory is proven because it is compelling. It does not reduce a child to pageant footage. It does not turn living people into villains without evidence strong enough to justify the accusation. It does not mistake mystery for entertainment without moral cost. The internet intensified what television began. In earlier decades, true crime speculation moved through newspapers, books, and broadcast programs. With the internet, it became participatory. People built timelines, posted floor plans, compared handwriting, analyzed interviews, argued over DNA, studied photographs, and accused suspects from behind screens. Some did so with genuine care for the victim and with respect for evidence. Others did so with the reckless confidence that distance encourages. The Ramsey case became one of the great online laboratories of amateur investigation, showing both the promise and danger of crowdsourced attention. Public pressure can keep a cold case visible. It can push agencies to update evidence testing, release information, or revisit assumptions. But public pressure can also create harassment, misinformation, and false certainty. The internet rarely punishes people for being wrong about a suspect. The people named, however, may carry the damage for years. The case therefore stands as a warning about the ethics of speculation. Curiosity is human. Accusation is consequential. A person can explore theories without forgetting that every name belongs to a life outside the theory. The investigative consequences continue into the present because the case remains open and because forensic technology has changed the landscape of cold cases. Genetic genealogy and advanced DNA testing have solved crimes once thought unreachable. That possibility gives JonBenét's case a thin but real line of hope. Boulder police have publicly described ongoing work, evidence review, and cooperation with outside partners. And recent reporting has noted renewed testing and interviews. The hope is obvious. Perhaps a profile can be strengthened, a sample retested, a genealogy lead built, a connection made. A name finally attached to the unknown biological evidence. But hope must remain honest. DNA is powerful only when it is probative, reliable, and connected to the crime in a way that can withstand challenge. If the relevant sample is partial, mixed, degraded, contaminated, or unrelated to the killer, technology may not deliver the miracle the public imagines. Cold case breakthroughs are real, but they are not guaranteed. The danger is that every announcement of new testing can become another emotional spike for a family, and an audience that has already endured too many false horizons. Still, the search matters. A case that remains open remains capable, at least in principle, of being solved. The passage of time does not erase the obligation. It changes the tools. It changes the witnesses. It changes the people carrying the work. But it does not change the fact that a child was killed and that the person responsible has not faced a public legal reckoning. There is also a cultural consequence around the idea of innocence itself. JonBenét's image forced America to confront uncomfortable contradictions. A child presented in adult-coded glamour, a wealthy family both admired and resented. A safe city made unsafe, a mother judged through pageant culture, a father judged through composure, a brother judged through awkward survival. The case became a vessel for anxieties that extended far beyond Boulder. People argued about parenting, beauty, class, law enforcement, privilege, media exploitation, and the sexualization of children. These conversations were not irrelevant, but they often became tangled with the murder in ways that risked implying explanation where there was only discomfort. It is possible to critique child pageant culture without suggesting it explains JonBenét's death. It is possible to question the family's public image without converting suspicion into proof. It is possible to acknowledge wealth and legal advantage without assuming guilt. It is possible to believe police mishandled the case without believing every later theory built on that mishandling. The Ramsey case demands that kind of complexity, but public obsession often prefers simplicity. It wants a monster. It wants a secret. It wants the final line that makes all earlier details click. When reality refuses, the public sometimes invents the click for itself. The final reflection must therefore return to humility. Humility is not weakness in an unsolved case. It is respect for the victim and for truth. It means admitting what is known, what is disputed, and what cannot responsibly be claimed. It means holding open the possibility that one's preferred theory may be wrong. It means understanding that the person who seems suspicious on television may be innocent, and the person who seems unlikely may not be. It means recognizing that investigators can make mistakes without being corrupt, that families can behave strangely without being guilty, that DNA can matter without answering everything, and that a famous case can be familiar without being understood. Humility does not make the story less powerful. It makes it more honest. JonBenet Ramsey's life was short, but the aftermath of her death has been long enough to distort memory. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more the victim risks becoming a symbol of the case rather than the reason for it. In JonBenet's case, the symbol became unusually strong: blonde curls, pageant smile. Christmas setting, basement darkness, ransom note. These elements are so vivid that they can overpower the quieter truth of personhood. A child is not made more worthy of justice because she was beautiful, wealthy, photographed, or famous after death. She was worthy because she was alive. That must be said plainly because true crime often gives disproportionate attention to victims whose images fit certain media patterns. JonBenet became famous partly because her story contained visual and social elements that news culture could not resist. But the moral value of her life did not come from those elements. It came from her humanity. To remember her properly is to imagine not only the child in pageant footage, but the child offstage. Tired at the end of a long day, perhaps impatient, perhaps playful, perhaps ordinary in the moments no one recorded. It is to allow her to be more than the face on a cold case poster. The consequences of the case also include the way it changed families watching from afar. Parents saw in the story a nightmare that violated the deepest promise of home. A child was not lost in a public place. She was found inside the family house. That fact created a special fear because it suggested that danger did not need to break the world dramatically to enter it. It could appear in the place where Christmas lights were still glowing. It could exist beneath the bedrooms. It could hide behind assumptions of safety. The Ramsey case entered the private imagination of American parents because it touched the question every parent tries not to ask at night: what if protection is not enough? That fear helped fuel the obsession, but fear can distort judgment. The more terrifying a crime is, the more urgently people want an explanation that restores order. If the family did it, then the danger is contained inside a broken household unlike one's own. If an intruder did it, then the danger is an outsider who might be caught by better locks, better alarms, better vigilance. Each theory offers a different form of emotional control. But the unresolved case denies that control. It leaves the fear open. Perhaps that is one reason people keep returning to it. They are not only asking who killed JonBenet. They're asking whether the world can be made safe again by knowing. The answer is painful. Knowing would matter profoundly, but it would not restore what was taken. Justice is necessary, but it is not resurrection. Even if tomorrow brings a name, an arrest, and evidence strong enough to stand in court, JonBenet will still be 6 years old forever in public memory, and her family's lost years will not be returned. A solved case would change the meaning of the past, but it would not undo it. This does not make justice less important. It makes justice more solemn. The purpose of solving the case is not to create entertainment's final episode. It is to restore truth where speculation has ruled, to remove false suspicion from the innocent, to place responsibility where it belongs, and to honor the victim with something stronger than memory. Justice, if it comes, must be treated not as a twist, but as an accounting. The story's final emotional movement should therefore be quiet, not sensational. Imagine Boulder again in winter. Not as a crime scene diagram, but as a real place with cold air in the lungs and mountains standing beyond the rooftops. The house on 15th Street is no longer simply a family home in the public mind. It is a symbol, but symbols can become prisons. Inside that symbol, try to recover the ordinary child. She is not walking toward a stage. She is not frozen in a still photograph. She is moving through the small motions of childhood, reaching for a toy. Listening to adults talk above her, growing sleepy after Christmas. Trusting the house around her because children must trust before they learn how fragile trust can be. That is the life the case should keep returning to. Not the theories first. Not the suspects first. Not the spectacle first. The child first. The unsolved nature of JonBenet Ramsey's murder will continue to draw attention because mystery has gravity. But attention must be made worthy of its subject. To speak her name responsibly is to refuse cruelty disguised as analysis. It is to refuse certainty borrowed from emotion. It is to refuse the flattening of grief into character evidence. It is to remember that the lack of a verdict is not permission to convict anyone in the imagination without proof. It is also to refuse forgetting. The case remains open, and open cases require pressure, memory, and care. Tips may still matter. Testing may still matter. New eyes may still matter. Old evidence may still hold something not understood before. The passage of nearly 3 decades does not make truth irrelevant. It makes truth more difficult and more necessary. In the end, the Ramsey case is not only a story about a killing. It is a story about the aftermath of uncertainty. It shows what happens when a crime scene is compromised, when institutions divide, when wealth and suspicion collide, when media turns pain into content, when science offers hope without immediate closure, and when a little girl's image becomes more famous than the justice owed to her. It asks whether society can look at an unresolved case without turning it into a game. It asks whether we can hold grief, doubt, anger, and restraint in the same hands. It asks whether truth can survive decades of noise. And it leaves us with a final image that is not dramatic because it does not need to be. A small child missing from the morning she should have had, a family home changed forever. And a question still standing in the cold air outside. Who killed JonBenet Ramsey? Until the answer is proven, the honest ending is not closure but responsibility. Responsibility to keep the facts clear. Responsibility to protect the living from reckless accusation. Responsibility to resist exploiting the dead. Responsibility to demand competent investigation without pretending that outrage is evidence. Responsibility to remember that the center of the case is not a note, not a theory, not a documentary, not a debate, but a child whose life was interrupted before it had the chance to become her own. That is where the story must finally rest, not because the mystery is solved, but because respect requires returning JonBenet to the human place from which the spectacle took her. The truth still matters. The search still matters. And until justice speaks with proof, the silence around her death remains one of the most painful sounds in American criminal history. Factual frame checked against Texas DPS victim records. The Department of Defense Inspector General report on the Air Force background check failure, and the Justice Department's civil settlement record. The attack occurred at First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs on November 5, 2017. 26 worshipers, including an unborn child, were killed, 22 others were wounded. And later federal findings addressed how the perpetrator was able to buy firearms despite a disqualifying Air Force conviction. Texas Department of Public Safety 1. Part 1, Introduction, Background. On a quiet Sunday morning in November, Sutherland Springs did not look like a place that would soon be forced into the history of American violence. It was not a city built to absorb national attention, not a place of skyscrapers, bright news helicopters, or crowds moving anonymously through concrete canyons. It was a small community in Wilson County, Texas, set among open roads, low buildings, dry grass, scattered homes, and the familiar distances of rural life, where people often knew one another not through headlines or introductions, but through generations, church attendance, school ties, shared errands, and the simple fact of living near the same roads long enough for faces to become part of the landscape. On November 5, 2017, the morning carried the ordinary weight of a Sunday. The sky above South Texas held the pale brightness of late autumn. The air would not have felt like the postcard winter imagined in other parts of the country. This was Texas, where November can still hold warmth, where sunlight can lie hard across parking lots and church roofs, where pickup trucks pass between fields and two-lane roads with the unhurried rhythm of places that do not expect the world to be watching. At First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs, people gathered as they had gathered before, stepping into a small white sanctuary that stood not as an architectural monument, but as a living part of the town's spiritual and social body. The building was modest. That mattered. It was not grand enough to make worship feel distant. It was not designed to overwhelm. It was a place where prayer had a human scale, where voices carried across a room small enough for absence to be noticed, where a person entering late might receive a glance of recognition, where children were not abstract members of a congregation, but specific children with names, habits, parents, grandparents, cousins, and favorite seats. In towns like Sutherland Springs, a church is rarely only a church. It is a memory keeper. It holds baptisms, weddings, funerals, potluck meals, youth events, Bible lessons, holiday programs, whispered requests for help, and the soft choreography of ordinary faith. A hand resting on a shoulder, a hymn book opened, a child shifting in a pew, an older member lowering slowly into a seat. A pastor's voice beginning the work of making the week feel bearable. The horror of what happened there cannot be understood without first understanding that sense of routine and trust. The people who entered First Baptist that morning were not walking into a symbol. They were walking into one of the most familiar spaces in their lives. They came because Sunday was Sunday. They came because worship was part of the week's structure. They came because faith, for many of them, was not a dramatic public identity, but a quiet repetition: wake, dress, drive, greet, sing, listen, pray, return home. Some came as entire families, their lives braided so tightly through the congregation that one loss would never stand alone. The attack that would follow became unbearable not only because of the number of dead and wounded, but because of the concentration of loss inside a tiny community where family names overlapped, where grief did not spread across millions, but landed with crushing weight on streets, relatives, and pews that could not make room for it. To tell this case responsibly, the opening must not begin with the perpetrator. It must begin with the people and the place. It must begin with the sanctuary before the violence, with the ordinary morning before it was broken. With the human fact that those inside the church were not statistics waiting to be counted, but worshippers in the middle of life. Among the victims were children, teenagers, parents, grandparents, married couples, and multiple members of the same extended families. The dead ranged from the very young to the elderly, and the list of names later released by Texas authorities showed the breadth of the wound. People in their 70s, people in middle age, people barely old enough to begin school, and an unborn child whose life was counted among the dead because the attack did not stop at one generation. A church massacre often becomes discussed in terms of security, weapons, response times, warning signs, and policy failures, and all of those matters are important. But before analysis, there must be recognition. A 5-year-old girl was not a debate. A 14-year-old pastor's daughter was not a symbol. Elderly worshippers were not background figures. Families with shared last names were not entries in a report. They were people who had arrived in a place of worship expecting the old promises of that place to hold. Peace, prayer, community, and the thin but powerful shelter of being together. First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs was the kind of congregation where the line between church family and blood family could blur. A small church often operates through intimacy. There are no crowds large enough to hide in. Joy and hardship become known. When someone is sick, others hear. When a family is struggling, meals appear. When children grow, older members watch them from pews and remember when they were small. Faith in such a setting is not only spoken from the pulpit, it is practiced through casseroles, phone calls, repairs, rides, visits, and attendance. The sanctuary becomes a room where private burdens can be carried collectively. That is why the attack's setting magnified the horror. Violence in any place is terrible. But violence inside a church during Sunday service carries a deeper violation because it strikes at a ritual of trust. Worshippers sit facing forward. They listen. They close their eyes. They allow themselves, for a short time, to be unguarded. A church service asks people to lower the armor they wear during the rest of the week. It asks them to believe that, inside those walls, vulnerability is not foolish. On November 5th, that vulnerability was betrayed. The story's background also stretches beyond Sutherland Springs into the life of the man who carried the violence there, but even that must be handled carefully. The perpetrator, Devin Patrick Kelly, should not be given the dark glamour that mass violence too often creates around attackers. His name belongs in the record because history requires accuracy, but the story should not orbit him. He was a former Air Force member with a documented history of domestic violence and a disqualifying conviction that should have prevented him from legally buying firearms. Federal investigators later found that the Air Force failed to submit required information to the FBI, a failure that allowed him to pass background checks and purchase weapons from licensed dealers. That bureaucratic fact is not a footnote. It is part of the background because mass casualty events are rarely made from one moment alone. They are often preceded by warning signs, institutional gaps, ignored violence, paperwork failures, and private patterns that later look enormous in hindsight. Before Sutherland Springs became a place of mourning, before emergency vehicles filled the roads, before families waited in terror for names, the systems designed to block a dangerous person from weapons had already failed. The perpetrator's history was marked by domestic abuse, threats, conflict, and instability. And investigators later emphasized that the attack was connected not to a religious hatred of the congregation itself, but to a domestic dispute involving his extended family ties. That distinction does not lessen the crime, it clarifies the pathway. The people in the church became targets in a storm that had gathered elsewhere. In the private world of domestic violence and personal grievance, then moved outward into a public sacred space. This is one of the most important background lessons of the case. Domestic violence does not always remain contained behind the door where it begins. It can expand. It can move from spouse to child, from family to workplace, from home to community, from private rage to public catastrophe. In Sutherland Springs, the warning signs were not abstract. They belonged to a person whose violent history should have mattered more to the institutions responsible for record-keeping and prevention. Yet on that Sunday morning, those failures were invisible to the worshippers. They did not enter church thinking of federal databases, court-martial records, background checks, domestic violence risk, or national patterns of mass attacks. They entered thinking of worship, of family, of Sunday routine, of the service beginning inside a small sanctuary in a small town. The contrast between those two realities is what gives the opening its terrible tension. Above the congregation was an ordinary roof. Beneath the ordinary roof was a community at peace. Beyond the walls, a history of violence was approaching. Sutherland Springs itself was not prepared to become a national reference point. Small towns often become known to outsiders only through catastrophe, a cruel transformation in which a place with countless ordinary memories is reduced to one event. Before the attack, Sutherland Springs was a lived place, not a headline. People drove through it, worshipped in it, raised children near it, visited neighbors, worked, worried about bills, repaired things, attended services, and marked time through school years, church calendars, and family gatherings. After the attack, its name would be spoken by presidents, governors, reporters, investigators, lawyers, security consultants, and grieving relatives. The town would be measured by numbers: 26 dead, 22 wounded, a congregation devastated, families shattered. But numbers are blunt instruments. They can show scale, but not texture. They cannot show what happens when one family loses several members at once, when a pastor is away and learns his daughter is among the dead, when survivors carry injuries that change the rest of their lives, when pews become associated not with hymns but with absence, when the church building itself becomes too painful to preserve for some and too sacred to demolish for others. The later debate over the physical church building, which became a memorial and was eventually the subject of painful decisions about demolition, reveals how long the consequences of such a massacre continue. A building can hold memory, but it can also hold trauma. For some families, preserving the sanctuary may feel like preserving witness. For others, seeing it remain may feel like being forced to pass the wound each day. This conflict is not simple because grief is not uniform. Communities often speak of healing as if it were a shared road, but after mass violence, survivors and families may walk in different directions while carrying the same loss. The background of the Sutherland Springs murders, therefore, includes not only the minutes of the attack, but the years of mourning that followed and the question of what a community is supposed to do with a place where prayer and death became inseparable. Sunday services are built from predictable sounds: a door opening, shoes on the floor, low greetings, pages turning, a child whispering and being gently quieted, a piano or recorded music, the pastor or visiting preacher preparing to speak. In a small sanctuary, each sound is near. There is no distance between the front and the back that can turn people into strangers. The congregation that morning included relatives gathered under the same roof. And this is why the casualties cut so deeply into family structures. The Holcomb family, for example, suffered an almost unimaginable concentration of loss, with multiple relatives killed, including an unborn child. Other families, too, were struck across generations. When a massacre takes one person from a family, the grief is already vast. When it takes many, grief becomes architectural. It changes the structure of